You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the nonprofit news outlet exploring solutions for sustainability and equity in water. I'm the host, Travis Loop. Texas springs are under pressure. Growing cities and drought are draining the aquifers that keep them flowing, threatening both people and ecosystems. But there are solutions, including stronger groundwater management, conservation efforts, and policies that balance human needs with nature. I traveled to the Lone Star State to see these firsthand. Before we dive into the episode, I want to thank you, the audience, for making this platform possible. To support Waterloop, please subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Thanks for being part of the conversation. Waterloop. My first stop in Texas is at the iconic Barton Springs, right in the heart of Austin, a place that draws over 800,000 visitors a year. The water, fed by the Edwards Aquifer, stays at a crisp 68 to 70 degrees year-round, making it the perfect spot to cool off from the Texas heat. I'm looking forward to taking a swim myself. But Barton Springs is more than just a recreational hub. It's a lifeline. The aquifer that feeds this spring supplies water to millions, highlighting the critical need for sustainable groundwater management in the face of urban growth. At Barton Springs, I'll speak with Vanessa Puig Williams from the Environmental Defense Fund about the bigger picture of aquifer protection, with Robert Mace from the University of Texas for insights into water science, and with Tim Loftus from the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District to understand the local strategies in place to protect this vital resource. Waterloop. Vanessa, we are at Barton Springs in Austin, Texas. What is this place?
Well, it's the crown jewel of Austin, and that's because there's really nothing like it in all of Texas, and I think really all over the U.S. There's very few spring-fed swimming holes that people can enjoy like this. It's sourced from groundwater, which is different than I think most places that people swim, which means that it's always cool and it flows year round. We are incredibly fortunate to be able to have this here in Austin. It's just a place where people come and relax and swim, and it draws like tourists from all over the world here, and it's just really what makes Austin unique.
So Texas Springs, this is in that broad portfolio of Texas Springs. I am not super familiar with them. Excited to be on this trip to learn more. I think a lot of the audience probably isn't very familiar with Texas Springs. Could you just describe these and kind of how they fit into the state's water portfolio?
Most springs in Texas kind of come from groundwater beneath the surface. In central Texas, our aquifers are karst, so they're limestone, and they recharge fairly quickly. So when we get a good amount of rain, that aquifer fills up, and because it's under pressure between layers of rock, that water then comes to the surface. And when it comes to the surface, that's called a spring. And so it's very clean because the limestone helps to filter it. And it's also very cool because it's been underground. And springs, they do a whole lot of amazing things for both people and nature. People get to enjoy, kind of just recreating in springs. Springs often form headwaters to our streams and rivers. So obviously they're important for like aquatic ecosystems too, but almost half of our water supply in Texas comes from surface water. The other half approximately comes from groundwater. So, we are really dependent on spring flow to keeping our water supplies intact.
What have been the challenges and the pressures on the springs in Texas? They're not like they used to be 100 years ago. What's happened to them?
Two things that I think are putting pressure on spring systems. It's drought. We're sitting here in mid-October and it's 97 degrees outside. It hasn't rained in months. And so without that rain, the springs are just not going to be recharged because the aquifers aren't, filling back up. And then it's also just the extreme population growth, because the more and more people that are here, particularly people who are moving into areas where that groundwater actually feeds spring systems, they're drilling more wells, that's pumping more groundwater, lowering aquifer levels, and then that's impacting spring flow as well.
So then turning to the solution side, what are the efforts of Environmental Defense Fund and others to try to make these springs more sustainable?
What's unique about Barton Springs and the Edwards Aquifer, so I'll just maybe explain a little bit. Barton Springs actually comes from the Barton Springs segment of the Edwards Aquifer. And the Edwards Aquifer, like I was saying, is a karst aquifer that is pretty regional. It spans several different counties. And the reason that Barton Springs and some of the other Edwards Aquifer springs like San Marcos Springs and Comal Springs are still flowing is because of the endangered species that live in them. So in Barton Springs, we have some endangered salamanders. There's some other species in San Marcos and Comal. And basically, the government has said that these springs have to be managed in order to keep them flowing, to maintain the habitat, which is the water, the spring water, for these different species. And so what that's done is actually created more stringent regulations. It's meant that there has to be less groundwater pumping occurring and to ensure that the springs keep flowing. Unfortunately, in other parts of the state where we have smaller springs like Jacob's Well, or the numerous springs like throughout the hill country and across the state where we don't have endangered species, there really aren't any sorts of regulatory mechanisms in place to keep those springs flowing. So the tools are kind of voluntary. And so it's up to local groundwater conservation districts, if they exist, to really sort of exert more authority over how they're going to manage groundwater to protect those springs. And that has been a pretty difficult situation for many groundwater districts in Texas, because groundwater is private property. And groundwater districts have a really tricky balancing act of having to manage both the conservation and the development of groundwater and to protect property rights. We think at EDF that there's also a right to conserve groundwater, but unfortunately, most of the way we've approached groundwater management in Texas has been just to give people the right to produce it. What we see with Barton Springs and the management of the Edwards Aquifer is a little bit different, where it is managed sustainably for the long term.
How so? How do they balance that?
Well, in the Edwards Aquifer, there's a cap on production. So the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which is the entity that is managing groundwater to protect spring flow, cannot give out any more permits. And that cap is in place in order to protect spring flow. And so what it's meant is that there's a market that has developed where people are buying and trading those groundwater permits, those groundwater rights. So it's a pretty phenomenal example, I think, of like how a sustainable groundwater management framework can operate. And we don't really have anything like that in the rest of the state. And I just have always found it so interesting that we have this spring, Barton Springs, flowing that everybody comes here to enjoy, and it's because of the salamander. Like we should want to protect these springs for our own enjoyment too, and for the benefit of people. I mean, obviously, I work for an environmental organization, and so nature and protecting habitat like that are extremely important. But people need to have this water keep flowing too, and so we should really be, I think, thinking about how we can adopt regulations that achieve that as well.
We're sitting here in downtown Austin, basically on a hot October day, and there's hundreds of people here.
I don't see any salamanders.
So I see hundreds of people swimming, enjoying it, getting a break from the heat, having a good time, driving the local economy, all that. So there's many benefits to protecting water in this way. So policy and these plans are a really key way to kind of protect and restore. Are there any other mechanisms or types of projects that help this Texas Springs?
A lot of voluntary water conservation transactions are really important. And we have good examples of that, I think, throughout the state where the city of Austin has, through bond money over the years, purchased a lot of conservation easements in the watershed for Barton Springs in order to protect that water quality. So that's a voluntary way that landowners, can receive a benefit for not developing their property and then having more straws go into the ground.
Waterloop. So springs are good canaries in the coal mine for what's happening in terms of groundwater pumping production, as well as water quality. And so what we're seeing in Texas is that as more pumping has occurred, we're seeing springs drying up. The flow's going down, and in some cases, completely drying up. We did a study at the Meadows Center that showed that over the last 50 years, 3 times as many springs have gone dry. And so this is a constant thing. So one of the things that springs indicate is sustainable pumping. Are we pumping too much? And when a spring goes dry, that's a good indication that we're pumping too much in order to keep that resource sustainable for the long haul.
What about the pressures of climate change, the hotter days, less rain hitting this part of the country? I mean, that's probably starting to factor into.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. Nobody in Texas has quite linked spring drying up directly to climate change, in large part because we have all these factors existing at the same time. But I'm seeing in my research more and more data suggesting that indeed that's an impact. For example, looking at a spring west of here, it's also a karstic aquifer spring that there's not a whole lot of pumping out there, but there's been what appears to be a 20% decline in rainfall, and so that's affecting the flows.
Talk about kind of research side and maybe solutions or trying to address some of this. What are some of the research that you're doing, that others are doing to try to better understand what's going on with springs that can maybe feed into policies or projects?
Sure. So interestingly enough, despite the importance of springs, very few of them are monitored in a systematic way. Springs like this, these big dramatic springs like Barton Springs, we've got a record that goes back a long time. But the vast majority of springs in Texas, we don't know how they're responding to seasonal variations in rainfall, climate change, or increased levels of pumping. So first and foremost is collecting that data that helps us understand what's happening, what's causing what's happening. And as a scientist, the first thing is understand what's going on. And then once you've understood what's going on, then it opens up the possibility of policy solutions.
So is there kind of an effort to try to get more monitoring in place? Would that be periodic going out and kind of sampling things, or, putting stations in? What would that look like?
So there is an effort at the state. They actually have a group that's focused on springs. And so they're visiting the sites more frequently. Unfortunately, it's very expensive to monitor a spring on a daily basis like Barton Springs, and so that becomes much rarer. But as landowners or people that enjoy springs become more concerned about their springs, there's a lot of citizen science where the people are going out, making daily measurements, and then reporting that to, could be reporting it to us at the Meadows Center, another university, or even the state.
Waterloop. We regulate groundwater, and we do so through a system of permits that are issued to applicants. Most of the permitted volume of the district is held by public water suppliers. And we have a variety of them. Some are municipal-run systems. We have an investor-owned utility or two. We have water supply corporations. We have special utility districts. So there's a variety of structures that retail water to their end users, to their ratepayers. And that's really about 70% of the water that's permitted in our district.
What has happened to make the Barton Springs more sustainable than maybe a number of the other springs that are around Texas?
Well, the short answer to that question is a lot of good science that the district did in the 90s and early 2000s, where they figured out how to regulate pumping out of the Edwards so that we could also protect the wells during drought that rely on that water and the endangered species. So we have a pretty elegant system of permits. For example, we no longer issue historic permits. We started issuing uh, conditional permits 19 years ago, and those curtail at greater amounts than the historic Edwards permits do. But that's how we manage then. With each successive or worse stage of drought, our permittees have to curtail at greater percentages so that we can try to maintain flow here at the pool.
We're here in Austin, which is one of the most rapidly growing parts of the country, booming. How do you balance the needs of a growing city, a growing community, with the need to keep that water sustainable in the springs and the aquifer?
It's really an ongoing experiment, and so we use those permits that curtail at increasing amounts. Back several years ago, people started turning to the Trinity Aquifer, realizing that there was no more firm Edwards water to be permitted. So the Edwards is pretty much maxed out in terms of what we permit. So we've got alternate water supplies, but we have growing concerns for the ability of the Trinity aquifers to sustain pumping, especially during drought. But then there's other things that people can do, whether it's aquifer storage and recovery, which is to take water out of the Edwards during good times when they don't maybe need to use all that water, and they inject it typically into a Trinity well for later use. That's a growing strategy across the state, although there's still not a lot of those systems in place.
It's like a bank savings
Kind
account.
of like that, exactly. And the city of Austin is considering doing the very same thing. In fact, that strategy is supposed to come online in the 2040s, I think. And then also desalination of brackish groundwater. Desal is probably a big part of the solution going forward if we can figure out how to safely dispose of the brine that's created. So deep injection might be a solution there. And then just maximizing conservation as much as we can to, manage demand as best as we can.
For my next stop, I'll travel into Texas Hill Country to visit Jacob's Well, a breathtaking 12-foot wide, 30-foot deep artesian spring in Wimberley. It's known for its mesmerizing underwater caves and is a popular place for people to swim. Jacob's Well is a marvel of nature, but it's also a symbol of the challenges facing Texas springs. At my visit, it was dry and stagnant. Overpumping of groundwater and prolonged droughts have left this well dry in recent summers, showing why sustainable aquifer management is so critical. Here, I'll talk with David Baker from the Wimberley Valley Watershed Association about the ongoing efforts to preserve Jacob's Well, and with Charlie Flatt from the Hayes Trinity Groundwater Conservation District to learn about the policies and measures that can make a difference.
Waterloop.
David, it's incredible to be here at Jacob's Well in the Texas Hill Country. Beautiful out here. Unfortunately, we're in the situation where the well is not really flowing, which is unusual. But tell me about this place, about Jacob's Well, about the aquifer that feeds it.
Thanks, Travis. Yeah, Jacob's Well is an artesian spring. It emanates from the Trinity Aquifer, the Middle Trinity, and it's the second longest underwater cave in Texas. Divers have mapped almost 7,500 feet of the cave, and it's the sole source of spring water that feeds Cypress Creek, which runs through Wood Creek and Wimberley, about a 5-mile stream, and flows into the Blanco River all the way down to the Edwards Aquifer, and it actually recharges the Edwards at San Marcos Spring, you'll see later. So this water is all connected.
Tell me about the current condition as we're sitting here, standing here right by Jacob's Well, seeing it not flowing, stagnant. Why is it that way?
The first time Jacob's Well stopped flowing was in 2000, and generally we have this cycle of drought and flood here. We have the El Nino. We'll see 7 years of dry generally and 7 years of wet. We've been in a longer dry period, about 3 to 4 years of really dry drought weather. But this is the fastest growing county in the United States. We have more people moving here than any place else in the nation, more rapidly. And so that demand for water, it's like a bank account. You're taking out more than is being deposited when we're in drought. But it's so important that that everyone follows these drought contingency rules, because when we get in these dry weather, the aquifer is limited, so we ask people to use less water. So the groundwater district manages that, and we message about that. But if you keep adding more people, more demand, it's difficult to stay up. And literally 1 foot of water level change can stop Jacob's Well from flowing in this upper part of the aquifer above it. So it's so sensitive. The margins are so thin. And so to manage that, it's a big challenge.
What has helped springs in other areas, maybe in the Edwards Aquifer, to be sustainable? And, what kind of approaches would help Jacob's Well?
The number one thing is setting a cap on pumping that maintains that spring flow. There is an aquifer level where that spring flows out, but it's setting a limit where we can't take out more than what would be sustainable is one. The other program that the City of Austin, City of San Antonio have been really innovative on is protecting land, ranch land over the aquifer where it recharges. We've started a program like that here, where now we've protected about 500 acres up above the well, and that in public land, but also through private conservation easements on private land to set that aside as recharge, both for water quantity and water quality, because these are very sensitive areas in terms of being able to be polluted very easily. So that's a big deal. And I think the other strategy that we've really been focused on is what we call One Water. And One Water is, water has value at every part of the water cycle, whether it's gray water, black water, rainwater, storm water. And so we built a school, worked with the school district here to build the first One Water school in Texas. And so that's a 90,000 square foot primary school, first and second grade. And we worked to design it to collect rainwater off the 90,000 square foot roof, plus AC condensate. We can collect between 600 to 1,000 gallons of AC condensate. We use that to flush toilets. We treat the water on site, and then water the grass with treated water, green storm water to manage the storm water. It uses 90% less water than normal school. Still uses groundwater for drinking water. But we think that if we could apply that to the residential scale, to all new public buildings, that gives us the margin, I think, to start to accommodate the growth that's happening, but also manage our water more sustainably.
The biggest portion of what we do is education and outreach. We spend a lot of time out in the community, getting to know the folks and understanding their wells and the aquifer. We spend a lot of time gathering data to develop science, so we have a better understanding about how the aquifer flows and what rate it flows and what its relative level is from the different parts of the year. What we see is a general decline over time. So we've got data going back 20 or 30 years in some cases. For example, with this spring, we've got almost 100 years worth of data. So we're seeing a gradual decline as the population increases. We're the fastest growing county in the United States of America. So we have a huge burden that we're trying to sustain. We're not getting any more water. Lots of folks think of Texas as a state of perpetual drought, hit by flash floods periodically. So it's all or nothing usually. The way we manage this aquifer is through a permitting process. Anybody that has a commercial use or what we call a non-exempt use has to get a permit from us. And what that does is it gives us an idea about how much they're going to use over a year. It's a mass balance equation that we're working with. Another way that we've been very successful about helping spring flow out in the long term is creating groundwater management zones. And what those do is they restrict the type of pumping that you might do in a spring shed to maintain the spring flow. And also anybody who lives within that area's wells will prosper because of the limited amount of commercial pumping that could be done there.
We're here as Jacob's Well is not looking too good. It's not flowing right now. Could you talk a little bit more about why that's the case at the moment? Very curious about that.
Jacob's Well Spring has traditionally flowed year-round. Very, very lots and lots of water comes out of it. What we see is population growth, and every time somebody moves here, they don't bring their own water. So they have to they put their own straw down into the aquifer and take what they need out for their family. We have no way of controlling growth, so that's a variable that we don't have any control over. The other variable that we don't have any control over is rainfall. So if we go long periods of time without rainfall, the population continues to grow. We see declines in spring flow until the next big rains come. In the meantime, the folks downstream and the economic engine of this specific Wimberley Valley suffers. Everybody who relies on the surface water from the springs all the way down to the coast suffers to some degree because that water is not coming out of this aquifer.
At a beautiful hidden spot along the Blanco River, I'll be meeting with Marcus Gary from the Edwards Aquifer Authority. He'll share his expertise on groundwater recharge, aquifer systems, and the challenges of balancing human and environmental water needs.
Waterloop. So the water in the Blanco comes out of Pleasant Valley Spring, goes for about 15 miles, and then it goes back underground into the limestone again, into the Edwards Aquifer, and goes to the springs there.
Why is the Pleasant Valley Springs and the Blanco River important? What's the different values and benefits of it to this area?
The Trinity Aquifer is a water source to people who live here, right? So there's a house across the river. There's a camp that we're on the property of right now, and many hundreds, if not thousands of people around here that have wells that get their water from the Trinity Aquifer. Many of the communities in this part of Central Texas get their water supplies from the Trinity Aquifer here. The Blanco River is a large source of the economy here in Central Texas. So the city of Wimberley attracts a lot of tourists. They like to come in and recreate where there's water, so that's kind of the local contribution, or some of the local contributions. There are broader contributions to the whole groundwater system of the Trinity Aquifer and how it relates to the Edwards Aquifer. So the Blanco River, as I mentioned earlier, flows downstream and recharges the Edwards. That spring flow that comes out at San Marcos and Barton Springs is the home to endangered species. So there's a connection. It's a little indirect, but it's very significant. So the health of the Blanco River is directly connected to the health of the spring flow out of the Edwards Aquifer.
What are some of the things that are being done or could be done to keep, Pleasant Valley Springs, keep the Blanco River sustainable?
If this area continues to get drier and more arid, that means less precipitation, which recharges the aquifer. And there's an increasing stressor with us as humans that are relying on this resource to live here. And so as more and more people live here, the greater that stress becomes. So we really have to balance that approach, is how we utilize the resource between human use and what the amount of water that we reserve to provide spring flow and river flow to both the Trinity and the Edwards aquifers.
Do kids in this area or that come visit get opportunities to learn about this water, and what role does that have in the future?
The things that we're doing today are going to have the effect on the next generation and the generation beyond that. So educating them as to how sensitive these types of features are in systems, hopefully can inform them if we to maintain them, sustain the resources in the future. So it's a great point. So we were here on John Knox Ranch Camp. Every single student that goes to school in Wimberley, where Jacob's Well is, comes out for a day or two throughout the year, and they get to experience the water and the aquifer and the nature and how that relates. The elementary school is Jacob's Well Elementary. The primary school is Blue Hole Primary. So there's a tight connection here with the education and the awareness that the community has.
My journey continued along the Blanco River, peaceful retreat through the Texas Hill Country, known for its turquoise waters and serene charm. The Blanco depends on the Trinity Aquifer for recharge, and growing pressure from urbanization, agriculture, and climate change makes sustainable water management increasingly urgent. For my last visit to a Texas spring, I went to San Marcos, where over 200 springs feed the San Marcos River, producing an incredible 150 million gallons of water daily. The crystal clear 72-degree waters are beautiful and perfect for glass-bottom boat tours. But what truly sets this place apart is its cultural significance. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples, including the Coahuiltecan, have considered these springs sacred. Visiting here gave me a deep appreciation for the spiritual and historical importance of this natural wonder. To explore this connection further, I'll be speaking with Maria Rocha from the Indigenous Cultures Institute. She'll share the deep cultural and spiritual significance of the springs and why preserving them is about much more than water.
There isn't any water spot that's more important than the Four Fountain Springs of Texas. And the reason why they were so important to our people is that in some of these springs, before they were dammed by the colonizers, had springs that would go up 15, 20 feet in the air, and lots of them, not just one or two. So you can imagine people arriving at an area where water was constantly, continually going up into the air, up into the heavens, right? That's a very powerful feeling to see that nature so strong and beautiful. So places like that were frequented, and people would go there for blessings, or they would go there to stay for a while, or they would go there to live, or they would pass through there as part of a pilgrimage. For example, the Four Fountain Springs of Texas are Barton Springs in Austin, the Sacred Springs here in San Marcos, the Comal Springs in New Braunfels, and San Pedro Springs in San Antonio. So there's this big arc of springs that our people would travel to get blessings from each of the four sacred springs. And then they would go down into the gardens, the place where our medicine is. So you're talking about an area that would be revered, that would be enjoyed, that would be a place for prayer and sustenance. And particularly here in San Marcos, these springs have never gone dry. That's really important to us, the fact that our Mother Earth has given us this water continually, and it looks like, hopefully, she always will.
Could you tell me about the rock art that captures the history and the significance?
Yes, there's a rock art painting in South Texas. It's actually close to Comstock, Texas, where Del Rio is. There's a place where the Pecos River meets the Rio Grande River, and there's a rock shelter there that has many paintings, different murals, maybe 200 or more, that were painted by different communities, indigenous communities, thousands of years ago. There's one particular painting that's called a White Shaman Mural, and it's carbon dated to be 4,000 years old. So our people, we know that our people painted it because it has symbols from our creation story. So it lays out our creation story. It also lays out all of the instructions for our medicine ceremony. We do an all-night peyote ceremony, and that ceremony is documented there. And also documented there are the four sacred springs. And it's really beautiful because if you take a drawing, a map of the four springs, and you superimpose it on the White Shaman mural, they match up. So you know that our people wanted to document these beautiful four fountain springs 4,000 years ago. So that's, and more, we've been here for 14,000 years. So
what are you and others of your people doing now to perpetuate the knowledge of the springs, the importance of the springs, and really advocating for their protection?
You see, we have a different perspective about the water and the land, and that is that the water, the land, the people, everything on Mother Earth are one entity. And because of that, we all have to work together to maintain balance among all of us so that we don't destroy the air and pollute the water and create an environment where we can't survive. So to do that, we try to teach our children and all the children here in San Marcos and push that knowledge forward about balance, about living the natural way, about not just seeing this water here as a great place to swim and have a great time. And it's not recreation, it's creation. Water created us, and you have to look at it as a very sacred being. And by having people take that perspective about water, it changes the way you see it. You see water as a blessing. Even a shower in the morning is this wonderful blessing that you receive. So helping people to see that broader, bigger picture of what water is, that sustaining life force, that's what we need to teach everyone. And that's what we teach our children. We tell them, if you come here and you touch this water, the water will always know you. So when you need help or you need answer to a problem or you just want to be rejoicing, you come here and you hold your hand up to the water and it'll remember you, it'll know you. We have a song about the water. It says, we will always remember the sacred springs. In our language, we sing that song to remind the children that this water and they are one.
Thanks for listening. If you want to support Waterloop's ongoing exploration of water solutions, subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Until next time, keep making waves for water.
You're in the Waterloop.